What's going on, fellas? I believe this is questions number 39. You guys can see the title, so maybe I fucked that up. But as always, thank you guys for your questions. We got a lot this week. And if you have any questions that you would like my opinion on, you can put those questions either in the comment section of this video, or you can put them up on the comments of the community post that I will inevitably put up the day before I do the next one of these. Got a lot of questions this week, so we're just gonna get straight into it. No blabbering from me. The first question is how to program pin squats / bench. I think I touched on this in a previous video, but what I would tell you is I wouldn't take away from your frequency of doing the primary motion in bench or free squats. I would use it as like a supplemental exercise afterwards. So if you're hitting straight sets, maybe drop off a straight set or two and hit some back down squats or benches to pins. If you're hitting a top set, then back downs, maybe get rid of a back down or two and add in an additional exercise slot after that. That's bench or squat to pins. And if you're hitting a single max effort top set, and that's the approach you're taking to your training, just add in a down set that is to pins. Relatively simple. That's usually what I'd recommend. I wouldn't take away from the frequency at which you practice the main motion, but use it in a secondary slot to emphasize the technical qualities and strength qualities you're looking to get from that exercise. Hope that helps. What is your experience with creatine? It's good. It's one of the few supplements that's well researched to, proven time and time again to be safe and effective. Generally speaking, if you eat a lot of red meat in your diet, the amount of benefit you're going to see from creatine supplementation is not going to be that big because your creatine stores in your muscles were already pretty close to full. And if you don't eat very much red meat at all, you're probably going to see a greater benefit from creatine as your intramuscular creatine stores weren't nearly full. It's going to maybe improve your force output across a rep set of 5 to 8. Maybe it'll even result in an extra rep here and there, which added together across the training cycle can compound into a reasonably impressive difference. And it's also going to make you retain water. Those are my thoughts and experiences. Let me know if you have anything more specific, but it's good stuff. If you're a bigger guy, because more than likely if you have more muscle mass than the average person that the baselines were established on, you're going to have more intramuscular creatine stores so it might take a little bit more to fill those up. So if you're a big guy, maybe going from 5 grams as is the general recommendation up to 10 even, because that's proven to be well tolerated, no negative effects. Worst case scenario, you basically just piss it out. That can be beneficial as well if you are a bigger guy. The next question is, what do you think about periodizing singles in a powerlifting context? I think it's great. I think that a lot of the improvements and results we've seen recently, some of the tested guys hitting numbers that would have beaten the untested guys only 5 years ago. Part of that is the gene pool for powerlifting getting bigger. You get more outliers the larger the gene pool is. And part of that, I think, is improvement in the training process and inclusion of singles in high specificity programming, I think is part of what has contributed to that. You can either do your singles on an auto-regulated basis, so RPE-based singles. You can do RPE-based singles with a percentage range. So you say work up to a single at 8 between these two percentages or between these two weights, or you can do it on a strict weight basis. Sometimes I like running people through the progression of a couple weeks out for maxing, 83% for one, add 3% a week, until we hit 95% for a single, and then max out the following week. Oftentimes, more often than not, whether you're preparing for a meet or whether you're preparing for a training max, I do not believe that going above 95% is necessary. I think that people are often fooling themselves with I need to hit this to prove to myself that I can do it ahead of time. If you're confident in your technique, you shouldn't need to do that, and you shouldn't dampen the peaking response, the super compensation that we're looking for to peak at the right time at the meet. We shouldn't dampen that to need to prove to ourselves we can hit our 100% 2 weeks out. Much the same, if you're confident in your technique, you shouldn't need to feel the weight. I think that's often a crutch used by predominantly lower level lifters that people will need to outgrow at some point, in my opinion. No offense to you if you feel like you need to feel weights. I just don't think it's a very good use of time, and I often think it's misdirected energy. The next question is how to get back into training after a week off because of being sick. I would probably just reduce the load, keep the training keep the training volume the same, keep the training program the same, just reduce the load enough to where you feel like you're doing quality work. I think we're all familiar with the feeling of we have a little bit too much weight on the bar, but we're able to get our 3 sets of 8 done. We just had to probably work a little harder than is appropriate for that phase in training. We had to let our form slip a little bit more than is appropriate for that phase in training to get it done. So we kind of forced it rather than kind of that sweet spot where it's hard, but we're keeping it clean and we're getting in good quality work. I would just reduce the load on the bar, the load on the accessories, enough that we're able to get in quality work. If you feel like your momentum was really killed pretty badly by getting sick, you can start over your training program or your training cycle. And if you feel like your momentum was preserved pretty well, just taking that first week easy to gain some positive momentum. Even if it feels strong on that first day, I'd still drop back the load a little bit. Worst case scenario, it's kind of easy and you have a lot of confidence coming into the next week. So that's what I would do. The next question, I kind of mulled this over ahead of time because I was kind of unsure what answer I was going to give. How do you personally structure an upper-lower split for general strength building and hypertrophy? It depends. If it's for me, if it's for you, if it's for someone I coach, it's all going to look somewhat different. Just based on their strengths, the frequencies they can handle, the volumes they can handle, what their training goals are, what the ratio of hypertrophy to strength focus that we're kind of working on, whether they're a competitive powerlifter, whether they're a competitive strongman. This is going to look a lot of different ways, but I'll just throw one out there that I like. It's an upper lower split. The first upper day is primary horizontal press, so primary bench press, secondary some kind of vertical press, overhead press. The first lower day is primary squats, secondary hip hinge, and then it's flipped for the latter upper lower. So then the second upper day is primary overhead, secondary flat press, and then the final lower day is primary hip hinge, secondary squat pattern motion. That's a rough training breakdown that I like to use a lot of the time, but it's going to vary too much for me to give you too much of like a specific answer, unfortunately. The next question is, and if that's not what you were looking for, please let me know. Don't hesitate to say, hey, specifically I wanted to know X, Y, or Z. I always want to give you guys the answer that to the question that you're looking for. I don't want to leave you with an unsatisfactory answer simply because I didn't understand the question properly. Never be afraid to ask a follow-up. I'll just touch on it in the next one. Not a big deal at all. The next question is, definitely share the footage. This is in reference to, I asked if I film just my top set in the gym. I didn't film the whole training session, so I can't really make it into a YouTube video in that regard. And I'll often toss it on my Instagram. Would you guys like me to share it on my YouTube? If so, do you want me to just throw up a short video? Do you want me to throw it at the end or the beginning of other videos? Do you want me to compile them into like the week of training? What do you guys want me to do with those spare clips? This guy says, especially if you have something to note about the session or small tips, or just have something to say. Sometimes I have something to say, sometimes I don't. Just let me know what you guys think I should do with those, as that's something I've been trying to decide. The next question is, if you wanted to see where your strength is in any given rep range, 8RM, 5RM, 1RM, but you didn't want to take the time away from general strength training to run a peaking block or do a deload, how would you go about programming that? Also, how do you personally go about programming in PR attempts? Okay, so I'm going to push back on you. I hope you realize that this is in your own best interest, I hope, or at least I'm just sharing my opinion. Testing where you're at is antagonistic to what you want to do, which is to continue generally building strength. Seeing where you're at is the enemy of building. I think that Joe Sullivan put up roughly that. And Carlos Reyes, a lifter I like quite a bit, shared it on his story. It's a sentiment that I agree with wholeheartedly. People will often derail their progression, they'll derail their momentum with constantly wanting to appraise where they're at rather than continuing the strength building process. That being said, we want to make sure that we're making forward progression within our training, but I don't think that seeing where we're at with a rep max is always the most appropriate way, whether we're hitting rep PRs, hitting volume PRs, hitting projected 1RM PRs. Projected 1RMs are bullshit because they vary so much person to person. That doesn't actually necessarily mean you're going to be good for that single, but it is a good way of comparing sets to see if you're making good forward progress. If you hit a tough set of 4 and you hit a kind of tough set of 8 earlier in the block, you can compare the projected 1RMs and see if you're moving forward. You can even make projected 1RMs using your RPE. So if you hit like set of 5 at RPE 8, You enter that into a 1RM calculator as if you had done the 2 reps in reserve that you're claiming. So you say you hit a set of 7, see what the projected max is, and make sure that gradually with time, we're chipping away at that projected 1RM. That means we're making upward trajectory, and it means that our prescriptions for volume, intensity, and frequencies are appropriate. So I think that we can appraise whether we're moving forward with those like PRs or projected 1RMs rather than testing where we're at and taking away from exactly what you're worried about taking away from. I think you're right to say that you don't want to spend time away, but I definitely think that this is the plight of most intermediate lifters, is constantly wanting to see where you're at to the point where you derail your training momentum. And then how would you personally go about programming in PR attempts? The way I do it myself and for my athletes is we run a training cycle, and the training cycle ends with a heavy single. It doesn't always end with a max, and it doesn't always end in a PR, but ideally it always ends in a PR, right? Basically, we're running through what is a long training cycle where we run through a, almost like a long, meet prep. We run through a hypertrophy cycle, we run through a strength cycle, we run through a training peak. The only difference between a training peak and a meet peak is we don't end up decaying all of our fatigue like we would if we were going to get on the platform. We just kind of keep some of that around, keep some of our accessories in, so we're not decaying and maximally displaying our strength. We're just doing enough to test if we're driving forward progression at the end of each block. It's kind of an audit to see whether what we did was good, whether what we did was bad, and make our decisions from there. That way, we're basically finding a repeatable process of building a base, capitalizing on that base, displaying. And that way, anytime someone wants to do a meet, they've kind of honed in this process ahead of time. We make sure it's in a sustainable way, so that way they're not walking into the meet extremely banged up. And it's a way to gauge kind of your program. That's how I do it, is every training cycle ends with a single in some capacity, and if things went well, aforementioned single will be a PR. And I think that people are like, oh, you run back-to-back, basically you just run repeated meet preps, you're gonna fall apart. Well, no, only if you're meet prepping in an unsustainable way. The whole point of this process is to find a sustainably replicatable strength training process, and doing that year-round makes the most sense to me personally. The next question is, when, in your opinion, should a powerlifter begin incorporating SBD days? So it's when it's necessary, depending on how many days a week the person can or should train, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then it's going to be determined on their needed frequencies. So if they are a big, strong guy, they probably will never do an SBD day because their frequencies on the primary lifts are never going to be so high that you can't fit that into a training week. So let's say they need a one squat, 2 bench, 1 deadlift, pretty common. And they train 4 days a week. Boom, pow, you never ever need to combine any of them. Maybe if they train 3 days a week and you wanted to bench twice a week and they can do it, a strong guy might have to do a squat bench day or a deadlift and bench day. But that's often how it's going to work out. On the other end of the coin, if they are an advanced lightweight lifter or an advanced female lifter or even an intermediate light or female lifter, and we're looking at these higher frequencies that are often necessitated for those lifters, right? Getting up to 3, 4, sometimes 5 days a week of benching, combining days to meet the desired frequency becomes necessary. If we want to squat 3 times, we want to bench 4 times, and we want to deadlift 2 times in an RDL, we start having to combine those. And that is A-okay. That's basically how I would determine it. It's based on, you look at the sub-demographic that they're in, you look at their mechanical efficiency, you look at how they're recovering from their training, you come to the conclusions that we should probably be doing roughly this frequency on each lift, and then if it necessitates it, we can combine them into SBD days. I view SBD days as a necessity for running up the training frequencies that we like to see, especially in lighter lifters, to maximize their progress, not necessarily that it's super specific to a meet. I think that part of them is a little bit overhyped, in my opinion. I think if you're training pretty hard, your volume per day, your work capacity should carry you through a meet pretty okay. In my opinion, if you're in good shape, you're in good shape. Yeah, so I would say it's on kind of on a need basis, not on anything else. The next question is, hey Sam, how would you go about programming powerlifting training to be competitive for an athlete that also wants to do recreational boxing 1 to 2 times a week? So I have a little bit of experience with that. Pretty simple. Honestly, boxing being a predominantly cardiovascular activity. Shouldn't impair your training too much at all. Basically, the main thing you have to look out for is the little bit of soft tissue damage that happens from the fact that it's a conditioning modality that isn't no impact or isn't low impact. Basically, you run through your own boxing training, whatever you're doing, you find what gets banged up and you make sure you work that around your split. So what does that look like? Don't do 100% heavy bag work. The day before you do a bench, your arms are going to be pretty thrashed. You're going to have some soft tissue damage. You're probably going to have a little bit of pain. Potentially don't do all of your road work the day before you do squats. So it's basically just finding your A and your B session for boxing, seeing what you're doing on those days, and then seeing what's impaired the following day, and then fitting that to your training split in a way that's not going to impair your strength training work. I do a bit of boxing work, as I think you guys may have seen on one of my earlier posts on my rest days. I just make sure that I'm doing the heavy bag work the day before squats, and I'm doing the lower body conditioning type work the day before overhead press personally. Does overhead press require singles to get that exposure to top end strength? I've been hammering higher rep work and tried some heavier weight just for fun yesterday and felt absolutely brutal, like I'd never lifted before. Yeah, so I think that this can be an issue is if you train your overhead press exclusively in higher reps, it does not necessarily translate to upper end strength as it sometimes does on other lifts. So the inclusion of a wide, like maybe a daily undulating, one overhead press session heavy, one lighter. It doesn't need to be singles. That's a perfectly valid way. I follow your thought process exactly. That's a great way to gain exposure to high percentages. It could be that one day you hit a 3x3 and the other day you hit a 3x10. But yeah, working in exposures to higher percentages doesn't always have to be singles, but that is often necessary for the overhead press for a lot of people. The next one is, do you ever notice how the powerlifting community goes through a certain type of training phase? Examples, DUP, conjugate, like Bulgarian. What sort of training do you think is mainstream right now? Do you think the IPF lift? It seems like the IPF lifters tend to be a fan of doing the SBD lifts in high frequencies. Yeah, I think that that's not necessarily entirely just a trend. I think that for lighter guys, that is a progression forward in training methodology. I remember, when I was first getting into lifting, we were just coming off the tail end of conjugate being the shit. People like Chad Wesley Smith started vocally going against conjugates, saying this probably isn't the best way to develop yourself as a raw lifter. People first started to kind of push the DUP stuff. Obviously you see huge waves in what accessories are trendy. Pause deadlifts were the coolest shit in the world, like last year. Tempo work was the coolest shit in the world before that. So on and so forth. You go through waves like this. There's that brief period where belt squats were like the end all be all how to build your squat. Suddenly people think leg presses are perfectly valid again. So it goes through a lot of waves. I would say that the higher frequency thing, some people are taking that a little too far, but that does certainly seem to be one of the current trends. I haven't been on Instagram very much recently, just because it drives me up a wall. So I have removed it from my phone and only gone on my computer. So I may be a little bit out of the loop as to what the current trends are. So I don't know. But you're definitely very correct in saying that that's how things work. You got a pendulum, it swings back and forth. First thing, intensity is everything. Next thing we know, everything needs to be completely sub-maximal. Swing back and forth indefinitely, right? Then the last question, which has a million questions in it. I don't want this video to be too long, so I'll try to get through them somewhat quickly. Abdominal strength as it pertains to bracing in the squat and deadlift. More often than not, it's more of a skill component than it is a strength component, but if we're looking at the strength component of the abdominal musculature, we're not looking for absolute contractile property or maximal 1RM strength in the abs. We're looking for strength endurance qualities, maintaining a rigid torso. So this can look like planks. This can look like GHD sit-ups if you're done in a way that you're never fully relaxing. This can look like ab rollouts as long as you're never relaxing. So that way we're building strength and endurance in our abs. And the king is just weighted carries. Again, strength endurance qualities in the abs are what we're training more so than we're gonna go super heavy and really hypertrophy the muscle. We're specifically always looking for strength endurance qualities in the abs. And that's kind of the litmus test by which I examine any ab work in a program is, hey, is this about developing endurance in the abs against a reasonable amount of resistance. The next question is programming abs and core exercises properly and how to keep the ab-induced fatigue from bleeding into the main lifts. So that kind of talks about my opinion on what you're selecting. I mean, you can also do compounds that are going to challenge your core more, so such as like a front squat. I guess a yoke carry is just a weighted carry. Those are going to go a very long way. Those are kind of the big stones. And how to stop it from bleeding into the main lifts. I think as soon as you condition your abs to handle a reasonable work capacity, they don't really get sore anymore. And I don't think they're going to have a noticeable impact on your primary lifts. Once you go through that initial kind of getting them conditioned, everything fucking hurts, coughing hurts phase. Once you get past that, honestly, I don't think you have to worry about it much at all. I do my working ab work prior to my main compounds, and I work pretty hard on them. I will hit 3 tough working sets of whatever ab exercise I'm doing prior to starting deadlifting and prior to starting squatting, just because I prefer to do it at the beginning. It makes my back feel nice. It forces me to break a sweat and warm up, and most importantly, it means that I won't skip it if I'm always doing it as the first thing. And if you're guilty of skipping abs, I highly recommend you do the same thing. Training the lower back and erectors if one has no access to a hyper extension machine or a reverse hyper. RDLs and deadlifts, my man, and barbell rows. You really don't need more than that. Reverse hypers and back extensions are a nicety. They can be great for running up additional posterior chain volume, but you can get a wicked strong lower back just from RDLs, rows, deadlifts, and good mornings. You really, really don't need more than that, I promise. How to properly manage volume on back days in such a way to not let the erector soreness and fatigue interfere with the main lift. That usually just comes down to designing your split in such a way where when you've accrued the most lower back fatigue, any upper back volume you're doing is with a chest support or as a vertical pull, utilizing those. Basically, you're always just kind of testing out what the limits of what your lower back can handle as far as frequency wise, man, that's there's too much individual variability there to give you like a cut and dry, but it's basically just finding what's the most my lower back can like benefit from, and then not going past that and kind of working around it past that. We don't want to avoid doing any lower back loading. It needs to get stronger at some point, but once you kind of top that out, acknowledging, hey, any more is probably counterproductive. I've kind of got that feeling, so I'm going to do my rows chest supported instead of a barbell row. I'm going to do, I don't know, hamstring curls instead of an RDL because my lower back is pretty thrashed. I would say that's my biggest advice, is feeling out where in the week you've accumulated the most lower back fatigue consistently, and then kind of backing off of it briefly. And he says his current issue is he's been getting stronger on the T-bar row necessary for back thickness, since I get no similar pump from any other exercise available, and I don't have access to a chest supported row or a cable row, but he wants to continue progressing his deadlift. So you can do those in a pretty upright manner to spare the lower back. That can be relatively helpful. I would really work on your ability to do a Meadows row, because if you have the access to a T-bar row, you have access to a Meadows row. You can post your hand on your knee, decrease the amount of stress on your lower back, and if you really work on your skill at the motion, you might eventually be able to get to the point where you get the quality pump the same way you get from a T-bar. But I think that breaking them apart rather than doing T-bars the same session as deadlifts, you could do them after squats or something, take a couple days rest, come in and do your deadlifts, and then maybe do whatever squat accessory you displaced with T-bar. So rather than taking this day we're gonna bury our quads, and then have to wait till next week to train them again, and then this day we're going to bury our back and wait till next week to train them again. Splitting those workloads between those days generally tends to be beneficial from a strength training perspective. So that might be my approach, is kind of spreading out your workload through the week. If you don't think the workload itself is the issue, if you think that maybe it's because you're piling it too high for short durations during the week, that could be a potential solution. So that's all the questions. I apologize how unenergetic I was for this one. For some reason, I am not awake yet at all. But as always, thank you guys for watching my video. It means a whole lot to me, and thank you for participating in these.